A very tantalizing picture starts to emerge when we look at animals whose natural rhythms are very different from our own. Small flying birds like sparrows or thrushes have a resting heart rate of around 500 beats per minute. Let's say about 6 to 8 times faster than the average human, and they have a metabolism to match. Over the years, many naturalists and sound engineers alike have slowed down recordings of birdsong and found that when they're slowed to quote-unquote human time, patterns and phrases begin to emerge that initially appeared as a single sound or as fewer sounds because the constituent parts occurred too quickly for us to perceive them as individual events. Or we find that certain phrases, when slowed down, acquire a distinctly musical feel. The most famous example is likely the call of the veery thrush, because of how musical the result is. Here is its call as we normally hear it. And here it is slowed down. If we go down this scale of tempos, past humans and down into the world of animals with slower metabolisms, we enter the world of large whales, whose songs appear almost like a series of disembodied drones hanging in the void. Once we're down at this speed, we're talking about animals whose heart beats only 8 or 10 times a minute, the equivalent of what a small bird might do in a second. And in fact, if we massively slow down recordings of birds, we end up with, well, actually the exact sounds you're hearing right now. These aren't actually recordings of whales. It's just the call of a humble blackbird, but played back very slowly, and with some water sounds added for effect. Conversely, if we take actual recordings of humpback whales and speed them up, we find that patterns and phrasings that were more spread apart start to become more evident. Here, for example, the alternating rhythmic interplay of two different types of call is immediately apparent. And many of the sounds that emerge, just as the blackbird sounded like a whale when we slowed it down, these sped-up whale calls start to sound an awful lot like birdsong. So you can hear that as we move through timescales, sounds that at first seemed quite different appear much more closely related. As you can imagine, these kinds of observations have led researchers to wonder whether these animals have a different relationship with time than we do. Certainly our human music must sound very different to them than it does to us. This is tied up with an idea that is known as the perceptual present. And this is the idea that the present moment that we perceive isn't an infinitely small pinpoint in time, but rather more like the circle of light projected by a torch, which has dimensions and does not have a precise limit. It blurs at the edges. And as this light moves through time, things become visible and other things fade away. Within the perceptual present, we can make sense of how elements relate to each other, such as in a melody. If all our experience was merely a succession of infinitely small points in time, we likely wouldn't be able to make sense of things like melodies. Experimental data suggests that for humans, the perceptual present is somewhere in the region of 3 seconds or so. And this is something that we all have an understanding of at an instinctual level. It's what we call a moment, which is a vague unit of time that is definitely not so incredibly brief that you're not aware of it, but it also doesn't last for more than a few seconds. The idea then here is that different animals might have a longer or a shorter perceptual present, and therefore a very different experience of time.